In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's Ralph Waldo Emerson. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. Right off, it must be said that on fountain pen friendly paper, this blue has a kind of greenish gold sheen to it. That sheen looks good, but does come with the ability to smear it days after writing. The sheen and smear issue aren't there on non-fountain pen paper, though. So there's a number of papers that can work really well that you can avoid that. You just lose the sheen with it. There is some noticeable tone variation by pen, and from the right pen, a little bit of shade along with a little bit of the sheen makes for something very interesting from it. So this is a very neat ink in what it's doing, but you have to really like sheening inks to go for it. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Pelikan M800 with a medium nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib. Now, I'm looking at it, but you're seeing me write it. I can tilt it in the light, and I can see the tiniest hints of sheen occurring with this fine nib. And you can get little bits of shading. Now, I skipped the no feather, no spread, because, yeah, we know it's Clairfontaine. I forgot to say it, and I just backed up and did it. Let's act like I did it in the beginning. This is pretty neat here from a fine nib. Looking at the zoom nib, it is much darker than we had with the fine. It doesn't feather. It doesn't spread. That's not shading that you're seeing, my friend. That is sheen that's making it much darker in those areas. And as it turns in the light, it becomes much lighter. So it can be both lighter and darker as a shading area. Looking at the music nib, because how it writes differently than the zoom, it is a little bit lighter than the zoom. And with that, we have no feather, we have no spread, we have no shading here, but what would look like shade is in fact the sheen coming through quite a bit. And it's doing it different than how the zoom did. Very interesting because we're really getting some different tones with those two different nibs. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We have no problem writing on the back of this page. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Sailor Pro Gear Slim Mini with a fine nib. A Sailor 1911 Large with a zoom nib. A Sailor 1911 Standard with a music nib. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It's not giving us the sheen because of the absorbent... There was a car going by that was quite loud. Nature of this paper. But with that, where it would have sheened, it's giving some shading. So shading is available with this ink. It's just kind of funny that the way that worked out, instead of sheen, we got shade. Looking at the zoom nib, way darker than it was with the fine. It does have a little bit of feather. Look at the word errors, and you're really going to see it a bit more. I think it's manageable for what's going on. That's putting a lot of ink down. It does have a little bit of spread. It does not shade. It is just there. Now, the feather and the spread that are occurring, considering that pen, I think are pretty good. That's really a gusher of a pen. Looking at the music nib, it's a little bit lighter than what we got from the Zoom, about the same tone that what we had on the Clairfontaine. The feathering is less than we had on the Zoom, although it is there. You can see it a little bit on the word hardly. Funny. Just happened that way. You can see it on according to Gauss on the third line, so there is a little bit of the feather. There's no spread and no shading. Looking at the back of the page, there's a lot of show-through, except with the fine, where it did very well. Nothing bled through and touched the page underneath, so use a fine and you can write on the back of the page. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, the tone of this paper has made it much darker than we had with the Clairfontaine. Now, we're not really getting any feathering. I say not really because my eye is drawing to one spot. And if you can't see it, it's not worth pointing out the G on the sampling. Just in the bottom part of it has a tiny bit of feathering. No spread, no shading, nothing. But I think it's very interesting. It's almost like a blue-black here. Looking at the Zoom nib, this looks like an incredibly dark blue, but not blue-black, and definitely not black. It does have the tiniest bit of feathers. It does have the tiniest bit of spread. It does not have any kind of shading. I do think this would work well on this paper if you wanted to use it here. I'm not getting any kind of smear as I'm rubbing it right now and not getting any of the whatever causes the sheen to move that ink. Looking at the music nib, it is right about the same tone that we had with the Zoom, really an effect of the tone of this paper. Its feathering is less than the Zoom, but the pen is not as wet, so we kind of should expect that. It's not spreading. It's not shading. It still is coming across as a blue, so very cool how dark this blue is and stays blue. Looking at the back of the page, the ghosting looks severe except underneath that fine, where you could easily write on the back of the page and nothing bled through to the page underneath, not even the zoom. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a National Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it is still quite a bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine, a little lighter than we had with the last paper, that AmPad. Now, we get no feather, we get no spread. This has been a common for this paper. It's done so well. We do get the slightest hints towards some shading, but only the slightest hints. You can see the H in that on the top line, or the second L of all on the second line. Obey starts, the B looks just a little darker, so little hints of shading. Looking at the zoom nib, way darker than it was as we were expecting at this point. Does it feather? A little bit. Look at the word the, look at the word same, look at the word bell. On all of the words, all of the way, you see the tiniest bit of feathering going on. And it does have a little bit of spread. No shading. I think what's happening with the feathering and spread, though, is nitpicking, and it's very manageable here. Looking at the music nib, it's a little darker, a little lighter than it was from the zoom nib. That bike just went back the other way. I don't know if it's coming through to you. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, so it's doing much better from it. The shape of the nib is really affecting whether or not it's feathering. So, doing great there. No shading whatsoever. I think I'm getting better at writing with the zoom nib, finally. Looking at the back of the page, you see a little bit of ghosting, but I think you could write back here if you wanted to, and nothing bled through to the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Aurora Blue. Here is Diatramentis Giuseppe Verdi Dark Blue. Here is Geherban Blue Myocytosis. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Blue number 5. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, still a bit darker than we had with the Clairfontaine. Kind of expected. I have high hopes for what's about to happen with this paper. The fine has no feather, it has no spread, it has no sheen, it has no shade. The only where we've really seen that sheen was on the Clairfontaine. It is a coated paper, these are not. So people are going to complain that it's not sheening and it's a sheeny ink. It's the paper. I know that. Looking at the zoom nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the fine. Something really interesting happened where I had to retake this because for a moment I thought I was seeing some sheen in these super dark areas. And it's not, but it almost is. Really, the word the had me on it. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get no shading, whatever. Sheen, I'm talking sheen here. It's almost coming through on this paper. This is a paper we need to be looking at in the fountain pen community. Looking at the music nib, it is lighter than we had with the zoom. It's about the same tone that we had with the last paper. It's not feathering, not spreading, not shading, not sheening, almost sheening. Those areas that you see, while I'm recording, I am tilting this in the light, trying to see if there's any amount of sheen. And it's not, but you can see it almost coming through. It's actually kind of exciting for that. For me, anyway. Looking at the back of the page, you do see that there's some ghosting going on. You could use the back of the page if you wanted to, or not if you didn't. That's up to you. I would. Nothing bled through and touched the page underneath, because this paper's a champion. While it's nice to compare it to other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Lamy, their Vibrant Pink. Here is an orange ink by Mont Blanc, their Gandhi. Here is a magenta ink by Noodler's Qin Shi Huang. Here is a yellow ink by Pilot, their Mixable Yellow. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get close-ish to the tone from the Clairfontaine, a tiny bit darker. It has tiny bits of feathering. It has tiny bits of spread. It has nothing for shading. It's just there. I'm hoping it doesn't bleed through. I'm hoping for a decent performance. Looking at the zoom nib, way darker. I don't know that this paper gets to stand a chance with the zoom. Does it feather a little bit? Actually, nowhere near as much as you would expect. Look at the LY of completely, or the B of bedridden, and the feathering's not really as bad as you would expect. There's a little more spread, but it's not so bad. No shading. This isn't horrible, really. Looking at the music nib, a little bit lighter than it was with the zoom, around the same tone as we had with the last paper. Yes, we get feather. Yes, we get spread. No, we don't get shading. No, the sheen's not going to come through on this sponge that calls itself paper. We'll just have to see how it performs on the bleed through. Looking at the page underneath, you see that I circled a bunch of spots with the zoom and the music, but none from the fine nib. Now, the fine nib you could write on the back of the page if you wanted, but why would you? The rest, too much ghosting. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? I like the shading and the tiny hint of sheen from a medium flow fine like I was using in the writing samples. But let's be honest here. You use this ink for the sheen, so go for super wet, medium, or bigger. Now, I'm getting better writing with that zoom nib. If you have a zoom, this is perfect for that because it looks so good. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to support the channel, you can over on Patreon. Thanks for watching.